Morning again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this morning's session on reputation management for senior business leaders. A few housekeeping rules just straight off the bat. If there's any questions or anything, just drop them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that and we can get to them near the end. We've obviously sent around a survey, so we'll be taking your questions from that as well and we'll get through them. But yeah, thanks for joining, and I'll hand over to Kirsten and Leslie.
Thanks very much, and welcome everybody. We're going to take you through a couple of hours of information about how to manage reputation in a crisis, and they do seem to be along like buses at the moment. So it's definitely good timing for a session like this. Just in terms of what we're going to cover today, Kirsten and I will introduce ourselves in a minute, but just to give you a little bit of an overview. Kirsten's going to go through some scene setting for you, and particularly going through some of the information that you told us, and thank you to the people that came back to us with their responses to our questions. It's really useful for the session to be able to see where everybody sits in terms of how prepared they are for a crisis, or how prepared people feel that they are for a crisis. We'll then look at crisis in action, and we'll go through how some other people have approached a crisis and what actually constitutes a crisis, or is it just an issue or a difficult issue that you've got to get through as an organisation. I'll then have a look at some of the stages of a crisis and look at some of the key areas where businesses and organisations trip up or feel that they don't know where to go or what to do. So we'll look at some of those key things. We'll then have a look at how some of that was applied in the real world and go through a few case studies of organisations that have been through everything that we're talking about today. And again, thank you for those. Thank you to those that sent us some questions, and we're going to address them at the end. But we can also take questions from the floor, and as we said, just pop them in the chat. So just as a little introduction to Kirsten and myself, can you move the slide on, please, Kirsten?
Yeah. Oh, too far. Sorry, there's a slight delay. Here we go.
Anyway, I'll just start. Anyway, I'm Leslie Bryden. I'm the Managing Director of Clark, and we are the PR partner to the SBRC. We've been working with them for about a year now. And in terms of why I'm sitting talking to you today, I've been in the business for over 25 years. I hate saying that now. And I've worked with a lot of brands, organisations, companies, institutions, and seen quite a few of them through crisis situations or issues that impacted or could impact on reputation, as well as advising organisations through a crisis. I've also worked with a lot of organisations to plan their response to a crisis, and that is a big thing that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of the success in coming out of a crisis is down to the planning and the preparation, which you'll probably not be surprised to hear. So either having gone through crisis or sort of done a lot of simulations and tabletop situations with a lot of clients, and that hopefully qualifies me to be speaking to everybody today and sharing some of our experience. Kirsten, do you want to introduce yourself and then set the scene?
Yeah, no problem. Hi everybody, I'm an Associate Director within Clark, and within the business I look after the majority, if not all, of our technology clients, and that includes the SBRC as well. My background is in working with technology brands. I have 14 years of experience working on Scottish, UK, international organisations, and many of those have included specialisms within the IT security arena as well. So today, again, I'm very close to what the media want, how they're handling it, the type of stories that they're taking. So we'll talk more about that in some of the more practical examples that we'll cover off. But maybe before we get into the details of the specific approach on how to take during the crisis, it's important that I think we set the scene a little bit, just to give us all a little bit of context. So again, as Leslie mentioned at the start of the call, we shared a little mini questionnaire, and thank you to everybody that fed back on that. It's not necessarily fully representative from everybody that's on the call. I think there was maybe only some of you that participated in it, which is obviously no problem at all. So there just may be some slight differences in how you may have answered some of these questions. In chart one, some of you told us that you do already have crisis plans in place, which is obviously great. But as we can see, there's many that maybe don't, or you don't know if you've got a plan, crisis plan in place. No marks down, because obviously you're here for a reason, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with advice on the elements that need to feed into that, that hopefully you'll go away and consider after the session today. When looking at preparedness from a cybersecurity related breach, really positively, the vast majority of people that completed the survey really felt that they were prepared, and you are prepared should that type of crisis hit you. But if we look to that question 3, that looked at the confidence levels, we can see that there's a little bit of disparity between preparedness versus confidence. So this is something, again, we'll hopefully seek to address over the next hour or so today, so that you do leave with a little bit more confidence in what makes up such a plan. And that doesn't matter whether you're a chair, whether you are involved in the IT function, or whether perhaps you're part of the communications team that would help to activate the business reputation plan. It's also worth just taking a moment to pause and remember the value of what a strong reputation can do for an organisation. And this is about the work that you do day in, day out, that every message that goes out that just reinforces the strength within the organisation. And it's about how you represent yourself to not only customers and partners, but also for prospects, prospect employees, prospect customers as well. And really the main benefits of a positive reputation is maintaining that professional image, gaining and maintaining customer trust, which in turn will help to improve the bottom line, hopefully, as well as assisting when you do encounter negative feedback. So hopefully when you do have a strong brand and reputation associated with the brand, therefore it helps to negate some of that negative feedback. And really by managing and maintaining that positive reputation, it will not only help to define your process, but also help you in recovery post-event as well. Similarly, as Leslie kind of alluded to earlier, you can often be, there is a little bit of muddying between crisis versus business reputation management. And that, I think, is something that Warren Buffett helps to really define. And reputation management is something that really should be embedded into all of your communications activities. That is internal or external. And it's about building that trust, which in turn turns into loyalty. So therefore, I think it's really important to differentiate the two and ensure that all that hard work isn't ruined within those 5 minutes. So what I'm going to start to cover off now is really looking at the practicalities and seeing how that has shaped into real life. And we'll look at the steps that we can take to build a really robust crisis communication plan, and how other organisations have approached their incidents that they may have uncovered. So last year, the NCSC saw more than 700 cyber attacks. This and 200 of these related to the pandemic directly. However, research from Beaming has also revealed that the commercial cyber attacks in the UK, attacks are up by 11% year on year. And in some cases, they are seeing upwards of around 2,000 a day just in Q1 2021, which is obviously shocking. I think that therefore means that we're unfortunately unlikely to see kind of slowdown in cyber attacks this year. And just in addition to some of the brand names that are on the screen in front of you, just in the last week, we've seen hacks with Merseyrail, Washington DC's Metropolitan Police Department, the University of Hertfordshire, and also CNC. So it's actually really interesting because it's because of a sheer amount of cyber incidents and breaches that are taking place. It may well be likely that many of these have probably passed by your radar despite gaining some media traction. And I think obviously for the organisation in question, it causes considerable stress. There is an element of cost obviously associated to the organisations that are impacted. But the simple fact is that the media are, quite frankly, they're overwhelmed by the amount of breaches and attacks taking place at the moment. They don't have the column inches or the team capacity to necessarily spend any huge length of time covering these stories unless you get it wrong. And I think that's the important thing, and we'll cover off on the next slide what happens maybe when you try and nip things in the bud versus a slip of the tongue that helps to just give more fuel to the fire and creates more articles than potentially could have been made at the beginning of the situation. So let's cover into those. So I think we've got npower and SolarWinds, two very different organisations and organisations that are based in two different countries as well. So let's focus in on some of their attacks because we've seen these come to light this year. So in npower's case, this was a situation that started to have media coverage in around February of this year. So npower had found that customer accounts were accessed using login data acquired and obtained by other websites, which is known as a technique known as credential stuffing, if you're not aware. What it didn't reveal at the time when it did publicise that this had happened was how many accounts were accessed, but they did say that the data that could have been viewed would include a customer's address, their date of birth, potentially their bank sort code, as well as their account number, or partial few numbers from their account number, as well as their contact preferences that they may have had, email, text, letter, that type of thing. The hack was then investigated, or it was in the process of being investigated by the ICO the last time we were aware of this. But what npower did straight away, as soon as it found out about the attack, was it closed down the app. It was something that they had been considering doing in the weeks to follow, but they just called it straight away. They then also made sure that their customers could continue to have a digital access to their accounts via the website and communicated that clearly and swiftly to them. I think that they were also obviously able to limit the negative feedback because of that clear and swift action. They contacted all of the customers with really clear advice on how they could move forward from it if they were individuals that were likely to have been impacted. So that could have included encouraging them to change their password, advice on how to prevent unauthorized access into their online account. But then they also looked at any of the online accounts that were potentially affected, blocked suspicious IP addresses, and then took down the npower app, as I mentioned. SolarWinds, which I'm sure many of you may have come across, it's something that, again, in the last week, there's been more media coverage on. That was a completely different situation. So in case you're unaware of the organisation, SolarWinds develops software for businesses to help manage their network systems and general IT infrastructure. And while the hack was on a very different scale to npower's, it's thought that around 1,000 hackers were working globally to infiltrate the system, and that it's been described as the most sophisticated attack that's been seen in many, many years. So therefore, it is kind of unsurprising that it gained so much media attention. But I think that the way in which the news was handled internally, obviously in the eye of the storm, there is no doubt that it would have been an incredibly stressful situation. The entire organisation was completely under the microscope. And kind of not surprising. Why? Because the SolarWinds works with many of Wall Street's top companies and also lots of US government agencies as well, such as the Treasury, Justice Department, Commerce Departments, etc. But the hack didn't actually, although a lot of the media coverage kind of hit late end of 2020, the process actually started in early 2020 when hackers broke into the system and added code into the company software. So the hackers, which the CIA, who have been investigating the process, believe were deployed by Russia. And again, that similar coverage we've seen in the last couple of weeks really has kind of confirmed between the US and the UK that they think it was the Cozy Bear Russian APT group that were responsible. They went into the system, went into their Orion system, and it's a piece of software that has millions of lines of code. They implanted around 4,000 lines of code, which would have been difficult to pick up because of the kind of the small amount versus the bigger nature. However, when this code was updated, it was activated as a push in terms of updates to their customers, therefore pulling in data from their customers. So yeah, the lines were secretly rewritten and sent as part of that routine update, allowing the hackers to gain access to the system using a backdoor system. They've exploited general bugs, and one of the main issues is that they also took advantage of Microsoft's cloud software. And it's now resulted in the fact that Microsoft have assigned over 500 software engineers into probing the breach, why it happened, and how it could actually happen. Because of the government agencies and the size of organisations that SolarWinds work with, they have about 18,000 customers. It was put under global scrutiny. And in around March time, the organisation was brought before the US Senate. And particularly stressful situation, the CEO and many of the other senior team were questioned at the time. And during that discussion and that interrogation, one of the senior team placed blame on an intern. And it's that headline, as you can see on the screen, that really has grabbed attention. And that blaming focus that the senior executive put on somebody else, it hasn't helped the situation. It has only added, again, as I say, fuel to the fire in terms of maintaining that continual buzz in terms of media coverage. I would assume that it's going to be something that, again, will continue, especially as the organisation is now obviously is working alongside the FBI, the CIA, and also the NCSC in the UK as well. So organisations are continuing to be advised to patch VPNs and cloud vulnerabilities. So I think that shows how one isolated hack has really had that global extension. And as we can see in terms of communications, that one throwaway sentence in a senior executive's head has become a major headline. If we just move on. So in terms of the actual stages of a crisis, in essence, the crisis may vary, or the incident that you encounter may vary, but the process should be pretty much as standard. And for those that told us that you have plans in place, it's likely that it follows something like we have on the screen in front of you just now. So this is a flow chart that is developed by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in response to a terror attack. But I think you can see that the steps that are outlined on here are very general in nature. And typically they're kind of broken down into 3 phases: before, during, and after. We tend to talk a lot about that preparation and the act of being in the crisis, but I think there's little really spoken about in terms of that wash up or post-mortem that you may conduct. But actually that is just as important as the other 2 steps. And you can see on the slide there that there are still 3 boxes dedicated to that after. And it also obviously allows you to come full circle and take the learnings from what you've experienced during the incident to take them forward to inform the future as well. So preparation, preparation, preparation. Obviously, this is a very important part of that first phase. It's important to establish who the people and the processes, as well as gather all of the information. As I mentioned, the situation and the incident may vary. We don't know whether it would be anything from a ransomware attack to a phishing attack that you may experience, but it almost doesn't need to matter at this stage. You need to prepare for all eventualities and know what boundaries within that you are working within and how you need to be prepared for all of that. So identifying the key point people who will be part of it will be important, and looking at the experience and the skills that people have within that team as well. If it feels like you don't necessarily have the right internal specialists to be able to support that, it may well be worth at this stage looking to bring in external resource, either through a consultant, etc., that may hold that type of specialism. Also, as part of the participation phase, and once people have you've put people into the various roles that they'll play in such an event, it's really important to establish the flow of information, as well as defining what everybody's specific role will be. And this takes into account everybody in that chain. So all the way from the CEO to the social media manager that you may have within the organization or you may work with. And ideally within this process, you will also have that single point person who will be responsible for funneling the information to the right people at the right time. As a third step in the preparation phase, it's important that you create a database that really lays out all of the core information that you're going to need to share or potentially have in your back pocket in the case of a cyber incident. So this would cover everything from understanding the jurisdictions that you work within, whether that be the countries that you operate in, or whether the sector that you work in. You need to know when such an event happens, who it may need to be reported to. So does it need to be reported to a government agency? Does it need to be reported to an industry body, for example? And therefore, it's really important that you take into account all of that information, as well as doing a stock check internally. So other areas that you may want to consider and cover within this preparation stage is understanding and explaining in layman's terms the level of encryption that you have within the organization and the things that you follow. Also where you may believe that there might be some vulnerabilities in terms of your security and any gaps, although hopefully if you do know that there are gaps, that should hopefully mean that you're working to get those rectified. It's also important to have maybe a physical contacts database of people that you need to get in touch with, contact details, so everybody from those government agencies all the way through to the team members that are going to be involved within the situation, the session as well. Another element in terms of planning for the crisis is really important to make sure that your plan is accessible. So this could mean having a printed copy in the office or potentially ideally in the home, because obviously this means that it can be picked up and activated immediately, which would be extremely useful in case your internal systems or your email have been compromised in some way. As part of the plan, there's various things that you will want to make sure that are detailed within there. So draft responses in terms of how you'll go out to media, they need to take into account the various different scenarios that you may encounter. They will obviously be draft, but will give you a good foundation in terms of content for you to take forward and activate when the time comes. There also needs to be a little bit of work done in terms of agreeing the content and the process that would happen in terms of activating and launching advice that may be posted onto your website. That can include the preparation of an FAQ. And equally, you may want to have a phone line or a hotline set up to field calls for any customers or partners that may be impacted by the situation. Another aspect to consider is if email is still an option to communicate and it hasn't been compromised, you need to ensure that it's set up to allow your technology to communicate with mass mail outs to your different stakeholders. And obviously, because this is the type of email that you definitely don't want to get stuck in junk or spam inboxes, you need to make sure that that system is ready to be prepared to work and activate and get that message through to whoever needs to receive it. But it's not just enough to kind of do all the planning and get the people in place. A really vital part of this phase is around the testing. People respond to the reality of a crisis in varying different ways. So by testing that scenario, it's something that allows people to see how they respond. It maybe allows you to change around who in the team may be involved in the actual crisis. It also allows you to really test the robustness of the plan and the content that you have developed to make sure that there are no gaps in it in the event of a real incident itself. And I'll hand over to Leslie now, who will take us through when a crisis hits.
Thanks, Kirsten. And I think you're probably beginning to get the idea by now that a lot of this is in the planning and the preparation. Excuse me. When an organisation comes across a crisis, all of that work that's been done beforehand, it just really, really helps you get through that situation. You know, if you think about any situation that you're in that, you know, where a lot of things are happening and you as an organisation have got a lot of stuff to deal with, whether it's a breach or something else, but you know, there's a lot of different things that you have to deal with, and you know, the more you can plan for that, the better, because then you can just start to follow the plan that you've already put in place. There are always going to be little things that say, well, we can't do that thing that we planned for, but we can adapt. But if you've got that sort of skeleton of a plan there at the beginning, then it really, really helps things run smoothly. And it also helps you as an organisation fix the problem that you're dealing with without adding the reputational issue as another problem. I'm just going to take you through some of the sort of key areas that companies find hard to navigate when they're in a crisis situation. And that could be a data breach, an IT issue, or another kind of crisis, but it tends to be the same things that pop up. Who to put out front, you know, how to actually navigate through, what do you do first, and you know, sort of what are some of the kind of tips that we can share with you as we go through, and then also how to deal with the media. So so I'm going to go through some of those things, and then Kirsten will take you through some case studies of companies that have done this. So in terms of you know, you've come into a crisis situation, you've had a major data breach, for example. Who should you field? Who should you put up as a spokesperson? Now, clearly, if it's an IT issue, if it's a crisis relating to technology, the person in your organisation that is going to know the most about that is probably your CTO or equivalent. But you may also, as an organisation, have some really good PR people that work within the organisation, and you've got your leadership team and your CEO or equivalent as well. So who should it be? We would say your CEO really needs to be all of those things in a crisis. They need to be seen to be leading the business, also to know about the IT, and also to be polished enough to be able to deal with the media in particular. And the CEO should be at the front of any initial comms when it comes to a crisis. going straight to your PR person and saying, can you make this go away? Can you stop this from happening? They can't do that, but they can lessen the damage by sticking to a plan and dealing with things calmly and dealing with the situation in, excuse me a second, sorry, I've got a real tickle in my throat, in a way that that means that the media get what they need, your customers are looked after, etc., etc. So although they can't go away and make things go away, do listen to them, because they can significantly help you in this situation. The IT people or security heads can also handle follow-ups, but the CEO should always be right at the front. They need to be established as the face of the situation and the owner of the issue. To be absent from this, and everybody will have seen this in the media, where a CEO is not sort of front and center of a situation, the story then becomes, where's the CEO? What's he doing? Is he on holiday? Is he not bothered? Is he not in control of the situation? So the CEO really needs to step up there right at the beginning. The downside of that, of course, is if the situation doesn't go in the way that you want it, it's quite often the CEO that ends up having to resign from the organization. So again, we're really, really underlining the planning, the prep, getting this right is something that you only have one opportunity to do. So during a crisis, and to avoid things going badly, the CEO and all the heads of, whether it's heads of HR, heads of IT, heads of comms, they need to be accessible to the people that need to speak to them. And by saying accessible, we don't necessarily mean, they need to be accessible to the media 24/7. They need to be accessible to the people that you want and you need them to be able to speak to. So your PR person needs to be accessible to the media. Your CEO needs to be accessible to your PR person. Your CTO needs to be accessible to the CEO and the head of comms, or your PR person, but not necessarily to external audiences. So, you get where I'm going with this. And within a plan, it's good to have that network or that framework of people and who should be speaking to who, because everybody has a job to do within this. And if you set out those channels of communication early, then everybody knows where they are and what they need to do. And to help everybody know where they are and what they need to do, training and practicing and practicing and practicing again is really important. I mentioned right at the beginning of this session that I've worked with a lot of organisations both through crises, but thankfully the higher number, I think, in my experience, is the amount of organisations that I've helped train and practice for crisis situations. It should be something that you do regularly. You can intersperse, so say you do it every year, you can intersperse a sort of live simulation situation where you bring in all of the different departments, and you might even bring in partners and external stakeholders and go through a really, really thorough crisis simulation, which large organisations like the NHS, for example, will do, and big oil and gas companies do it on a very regular basis as well. Media training should be something that a CEO should do every year, and it's sometimes a bit of a bone of contention, because obviously CEOs by their very nature don't have an awful lot of time, but it's time very well invested to take 3 or 4 hours once a year just to do a refresher on media training. That can bring you up to speed with changes in the media and how they've changed their approach, but also it's just good to sort of practice that, dust your skills off, and make sure you're up to speed when you need to do that. And also it really helps if you're known to your audience already and you're trusted by them. And this is where the work that you do for 363 days a year comes into play. If you work with your audience, whoever they may be your customers, they may be your external stakeholders, they may be the media. If you're known and trusted by them already through regular communications, keeping them up to date with who you are and what you do as a business and what your personality is and what they can expect from you, and if you're delivering on that on a regular basis, then you've built up trust. And therefore, if you go into a situation where that trust dips because of a situation that you've either has happened to you or has happened because of something that you as an organization have done, you can build on that trust, you can use that trust, and they will be more likely to allow you to get on with it and fix it and retain a relationship throughout it. On to the next area that quite often people worry about or get concerned about is just really what order do we do everything in? And I know Kirsten's done some of that, and you're also going to get a handout that gives you some hints and tips on it. But where do we start? A crisis situation has happened, and it's quite easy. You have to drop everything, but it's quite easy to not be able to see the wood for the trees. And that is why crisis, and any comms professional will tell you that navigating a crisis is actually quite formulaic. You've done all the work previously, and you can pick that up and you can start to work through it. It helps you keep calm, and it helps you just work through all of these different steps. First of all, gather all the information that you can, legal information, technical information. If you're going to tackle a crisis that's happening to you, you need to know what's going on before you decide what you're going to say. Try to act very quickly, but not to underestimate the problem. So that's a real balancing act. And it may be that early on, you know something has happened, but you're not sure what, and you may need to craft some messaging around that, because waiting for a few weeks until you've done all the forensic technical work that you have to do and then talking about it means that you're in a really precarious situation for a number of weeks, where if that information gets out there, then you're the organization that didn't tell anybody. So you really need to start balancing that, the importance of those two things. We need to get out there and say something, but we need to make sure that we know what we're saying. At the point where you do that, we would always say, tell the truth, accept responsibility. Kirsten told you earlier that these data breaches are happening so often now that while it may be for you as an organization, if it's happening to you and it's happening to your customers, it's a huge issue. From a media perspective, it's really going to become a big story because of something else. Not just the fact that it's happened. So it could be that it's been handled badly. It could be that you as an organization try to cover it up. That then becomes the story. It could be that there are some very special circumstances around your organization, in that the data breach involves vulnerable people or famous people. It's probably going to have that added element to to bump it right up the agenda on the news. And you certainly don't want it to be because you as an organization have tried to cover up, or you've tried to pass blame, or you've lied about a situation. Again, in terms of when you're speaking to the media or speaking to any stakeholders, you as an organization need to be calm, even although that is possibly the last thing that you are at that particular point in time. Be calm, but not blasé. Be concerned. You will be concerned as an organization about what's happened, but be concerned about the people that it's happened to. Quite often with a data breach, you as an organization, it's you that's been breached, it's you that information has been taken from, but very often that can be, the details of an individual. So you need to be concerned about them as well. They're actually the kind of victims of this too. and you need that to come through very strongly. It's data breaches are not necessarily always about tech, they're about people, and that needs to come across in terms of warmth, in terms of concern, in the way that you deal with situation. Again, don't downplay it. It's fine. It's, you know, it's not a problem. If it is, or then or if the situation escalates to become a big problem, then again, you're the organisation that's not told the truth. I think we saw from the case study earlier on that blaming others is possibly not a good idea as well. So it's very tempting to do. It's actually also very tempting to do when it's true, because sometimes, you know, it might be because one person did something. It might be because a partner organisation that you work with did something. It's not a good look for you as an organisation to be passing the blame. I would say always, rather than blaming others, you look at the fix, look at what you're doing as an organisation to try and contribute to the fix to that. As in all comms, and a lot of you will be used to this anyway, avoid jargon, keep it simple. You should always do that anyway when you're communicating with non-technical people who might be the media, might be the general public, might be some of your customers, might be some of your suppliers. Keep things simple, keep things easy to understand. And you don't always just get one shot at giving out information. You know, you can update when you have more detail. A crisis is a growing and kind of living situation. You should be coming out quite early on and saying that something has happened. But when you've got further detail on how it happened, or what the fix is, or how long that fix is going to take, you can update. You don't have to wait until that point where you've got all of that information. And equally, you don't just make one statement at the beginning and then go quiet. You have to keep communicating. You have to keep keeping people up to date. And share your learnings. Kirsten mentioned about this earlier on as well. Share your learnings, both internally for you as an organisation. You can learn from this, you can adapt your crisis plan, you can adapt your operations and make sure that these things don't happen again. But there are some organisations actually that have taken that further, and they've shared their learnings externally so that it doesn't happen to other people. If you've been involved in a crisis and your reputation has taken a bit of a dip because of that, and you share what you have learned with that with your sector, possibly even with your competitors, that is and I don't mean to sound sort of cynical here, but it is a really good way to start to rehabilitate your organisation's reputation. So certainly have a think about that. When we did this session a few weeks ago, there was an organisation who was on who had said that they had done that very thing. And it really, really helped them as an organisation start to build up trust and a reputation really quickly after they'd had an issue. So it's definitely something to think about. Going on to the media, which is when we talk about crisis communications, the one thing that everybody thinks this is the only thing that we're going to talk about. They are obviously really, really important, and they can set the tone of what happens. So they are a really crucial stakeholder in a crisis. And I would say in a crisis situation, try to leave it to the professionals to deal with them. But the sort of things that they are looking for, everybody wants an apology these days. It didn't necessarily used to be the case 10 years ago, but now, you know, an apology is, you know, is first up. Apologise, explain it, own it, fix it, apologise, and then that allows you to be able to move on. And it's more, I know we're it's sort of hardwired to say, well, you shouldn't necessarily apologise for something because then that makes you legally responsible for it, or you know, you're instantly saying that it was your fault. But from a reputational point of view, if you don't apologise, then the story becomes the waiting for the apology. The CEO has refused to apologise. I'm sure everybody has seen news stories relating to that. And what we don't want is for that to become the story. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to do. And it can really grow arms and legs. So, so an apology somewhere up front is a good way to go. The media want a figurehead. As I said earlier on, if the messaging is not coming from the CEO, then they want to know why the CEO is hiding. What are they doing instead? So they should be out front, and all the better, as I said, in terms of your comms throughout the year. It's much better if the CEO already has a profile. The media kind of know what to expect from them. Quick response: speculation about what's happened completely fills that vacuum, and that's going to make life much more difficult for you. If you're not the first person to talk about the problem that you're having and the issue that you're experiencing, then you have an issue, another issue effectively, because it may be one of your competitors that's talking about it. It may be one of your customers saying, this has happened to me and we've heard nothing from the organization. And that is just going to layer problem upon problem for you. So be the first person to talk about your own issues. Make things really easy to understand. Now, obviously, we're talking this morning largely about data breaches, and they can be really technical and really complex for people to understand. And that has potentially just hit the mainstream media. Now, it may not even be that the breach is really difficult to understand, but if you're a tech business, it could be really difficult to understand what it is you do in the first place. And that's where the prep comes in. We'll keep talking about prep, and we'll always keep going back to prep, but practice breaking what you do down into the sort of terms that you might, if I met you for a coffee and just ask you to describe what it is you do, the sorts of language that you would use, the types of phrases that you might use. These are things that you can practice beforehand and you can have put together in your crisis plan. And again, that makes it so much easier to move on to what has actually happened, what's the direct impact of it, who is impacted, and what are we doing to fix it. It's also really useful to have filler information. You'll know whenever you read in the media about a company or an organization and something that they're going through, the media have lots and lots of information about that business. And it's not just because they Google it. It's very often because that organization, one of the first things that they do is they're able to send out a sort of cheat sheet, a fact sheet to the media so that they have all that information and that they have it correct. It's of benefit to you that the information that they're sharing is up to date and accurate. So if you've got that information all pre-prepared, you can start to send it out to people straight away. It can hold off the dogs a little bit because the media have a certain amount of space that they need to fill. And if you're not providing them with information, whether it is just pre-prepared facts or whether it's about the crisis that's going on at the moment, they're going to look for more. So all the better if that sort of, little bit of the piece is filled with information that you've provided that's accurate, rather than a quote that's come from a competitor or somebody in your industry or an expert who's telling them where you've got things wrong. So again, the prep part, that can all be put together in advance. And then, as I said, updates, keep things updated as you go, be proactive about it. Whether you fix the issue, and obviously you want to be going and telling people about that, or maybe you found it to be worse than you originally thought. So, that is your message. You need to keep sharing that, and you need to keep updating people until we call it the end, but until you're out of that crisis situation. The message within that is yours, and you own it, and you need to try and control it. I'm not saying that you need to try and manipulate it, but you need to try and control it. It's your message, and you need to be saying it in your words. So just on to some top tips that might make life a little bit easier. And a lot of this is a review of stuff that we've already said, but build those media relationships before something happens. It's so much easier to deal with a crisis if you know that you know the people that you're going to be trying to deal with, and you've built up a level of trust with them. If you work with partners on a regular basis, ask to see their crisis plan, because you know, where do you fit into their crisis plan if you know, if they have some sort of crisis that impacts on you, or indeed if you have a crisis that impacts on your partners, you should be sharing information across these. Commit to that prep and practice, you know, again and again and again. Just even little things like not knowing who to phone, you know, not having the number of you know, of some of the key tech journalists that you deal with, or not knowing what the sort of phone number of the news desk at the Scotsman is. That can make a real difference, because if your IT goes down, or has to be taken down in a situation, then I think how difficult it is to work when our email or when the internet goes down. In a crisis situation, you need to be able to access all of that information, maybe without the systems that that you're used to using on a day-to-day business. So that needs to be part of the prep as well. Everybody in your organization is important during a crisis, and that could be, you know, from the receptionist to one of your major stakeholders, because if I'm a journalist and I want to find out information about your organization, I don't always just phone up the right person. I don't always phone up the PR person or the marketing person or the CEO. Sometimes I just phone the front desk and do a bit of fishing to see, you know, to see what I can find out. Or if you've got external shareholders, I might give one of them a phone. And, you know, if they don't know what's going on, then that's not great in terms of how it looks for your organisation. And come to a crisis without an attitude, I would say. You know, there's a lot of organisations can be really defensive and make it very much about them. As I said earlier on, whatever happens in a crisis, it's happened to you, but it's also happened to your customers. So try to be empathetic to that and maybe think about things from their point of view. And equally, don't make promises to the media during a crisis. You know, out with a crisis situation, the media are constantly phoning, asking for things. You know, they're quite a demanding beast, and that's my job and that's Kirsten's job on a daily basis to work with the media to make sure that they have what they need, and, you know, to make sure that what our clients want to get to the media is getting there. But during a crisis, that changes. You know, you're the one with the information. The media, is their job to get it from you. But making promises will generally put you in a situation where you will break that promise. Even just in a situation where if you're speaking to a journalist, or your PR person speaking to a journalist, and they say, okay, I will go and find that out for you and I will phone you back. 10 things could happen in the next 10 minutes after that phone call, and they forget to do that, and then all of a sudden trust is starting to chip away. They don't know what they're doing. She hasn't phoned me back. She's trying to hide something from me. So I would always say in a crisis, the best thing to do is don't make any promises. Just if you have a journalist on the phone and they want more information, ask them to phone you back. Say, phone me back in an hour and I'll try and have something for you by then. The rules are different when you get into a crisis, and take that into account. Again, not a time for exclusives, not a time for off the record. That's an extension to that. Don't make promises to the media during a crisis. It's really not a time for that. If you have information that impacts a lot of people, you don't take it exclusively to one organisation. You spread that message as far as you can. Keep your website updated. It can be easy to forget during a crisis, and all of a sudden, you know, you're dealing with a crisis and your website is looking, you know, like nobody's told the website what's going on. So it can be promoting something jolly and happy, and at the same time you're dealing with a big crisis. So one of the things in your prep is to make sure that somebody is responsible for going in, updating the website, and making sure that it is appropriate for what's going on at the present time. And then know your team, train them, prepare them. There's the prep word again, and practice. I think probably most people have got that by now, that prep and practice are the most important things in terms of dealing with a crisis. So definitely urge you to do those things. The one thing that people quite often forget about during a crisis, or can really trip people up, is social. So Kirsten's just going to take you through how to deal with that, the sort of the new front line of dealing with a crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, we've obviously at the moment, the kind of the first hour of the call, we really have focused on kind of the team and how to deal with the media, and also getting your website ready. But equally, as I said, everybody from the CEO to your social media manager needs to be prepared to know how to deal with the crisis that's at hand, and what to say and how to respond, whether to respond to posts that are coming through. So what we've done here is a bit of a whistle stop in terms of the 10 top things that we believe that you need to consider and take into account from a social perspective. Obviously, your social media managers or whoever is responsible for managing your social media will be thinking ahead all the time. What content have they got coming down the line? What does the content calendar look like over the coming months? When a crisis hits, it's important that you take stock of what content you have coming out. And it may well even be that it's important that you pause all of the activity that's going out, and in turn pivot the strategy to focus on the pure comms that are focused on pushing that message that's similar to the same messages that are going out to media at the same time. As part of that preparation stage, it's our favourite word today, it's about making sure that social media also feeds into that communications policy, making sure that that crisis is ready and the team are fully equipped and know exactly what to do. As I say, and make sure you've got your tiger team, the people that perform well under very fast-moving, intense, highly pressured conditions, who are able to field the DMs that may be coming through because a hotline might not already be set up, or if your IT system is down, it's another way for them to try and reach you. And make sure, as part of that, that the team and your wider employees are aware of your position. Whilst your company profile might be organised by and looked after by your social media manager, all of the teams that you work with, every single employee is likely to have a LinkedIn, a Twitter, a Facebook, and it's important that they know what they can and what they cannot say. They should not be giving away your trade secrets and saying, oh, I'm hearing all these rumblings happening in the back room, in the boardroom, in the office. It's important that you get their buy-in to make sure that they maintain that same company line that is going out externally. But as we've also mentioned, similarly to what we recommend for the media, you need to communicate with honesty, openness, and also compassion. If data has been released that's not just your own and it involves customer data, partner data, etc., we need to be aware of that, and people will obviously, that if they are being impacted, they'll be highly emotional. They will want to know what data has been breached. Particularly if it gives away certain bank details, or it may go down into level of contract details as well, that in terms of the relationship that you've got with them. So remember that you are, at the end of it, dealing with a person, and you're dealing with people, and remember that within the terms of the wording and the phrasing and the way in which you deal with them. Make sure that you're citing only credible sources. It's about fact checking, making sure that your facts are completely correct. If you're sharing an article or a quote from industry, or indeed if you're working with the NCSC, SBRC, etc., make sure that you are quoting a credible source, because again, that's something that the media or an external stakeholder could pick up and trip you up on later, which will be damaging to the reputation. Use social listening and monitoring to stay informed. Whilst it may be a decision that's taken that you don't want to necessarily engage with any comments that are DMs that are coming through to your profiles, it's important that you do listen and you take stock of the tone that people are responding to you with. Are they showing you compassion, or are they showing contempt? So I think that's also very important. It will also help when we get through to that final stage, when we are looking at the review activity. That will be really quite important in shaping the type of tone of work that you've been doing, the tone of content that you've been going out with. Avoid any trend jacking or activities that feel profit driven. Again, a lot of the activity that you need to be doing, and this will, as we said at the top, in terms of reviewing the content that you're going out from your social calendar, you need to take stock of the situation that you're in. And it may well be, although it could be a different part of the business that may well have not been impacted by the cyber incident, they also need to be aware and mindful of the messages that they may well be pushing out about a certain event or a white paper, something else that they might have worked on, which just might feel a little bit naive for them to take that forward. Leave room for questions. People will still want answers. And again, as part of that social listening, it may well be that you gather those questions and then at a point collate them and answer and update at the one time. Similarly, a lot of the work that you're doing from a social perspective needs to hit at about the same time that you're doing the media activity. It shouldn't feel that because somebody is on social, they're getting a head start in terms of that knowledge. Everything needs to really be knitted together and work collaboratively. And finally, don't disappear. Again, people want answers. The fact that the social presence disappears is almost in a similar vein to your CEO not being present. It will look like you have something to hide. And so it's really important that you maybe acknowledge the situation as a first step. And it may well be that your regularity of posts really does slow down for a short period of time until that end point that Leslie discussed and mentioned. But it's important that you don't just go radio silent. Show that you are there, show that you're listening, show that when you have updates to make public, you will make them public. And this would be the specific platform that you would be making it on, whether it's on LinkedIn, but it's more likely to be on Twitter, just for the people in terms of followings. In terms of what then happens next, so as we have said, after the event or an exercise, it's important to review what went well, review what didn't go well, and use that insight to inform your future plans. So this postmortem is really important, because, as I say, it informs the future. It may well inform the individuals that you bring onto your team as well. And being in the eye of that storm is stressful. So you are maybe going to encounter things that an eventuality that just didn't come up within the preparation phase and the testing of their scenarios. So it's really important that you figure out what those were, figure out how to smooth those over and rectify it for the next time. Or find people that displayed strength that might have not been part of your core Tiger team. And so it may well be that should something like this happen again, touch wood it doesn't, that you bring them into your team because they've shown a particular strength that you may have not seen before. So other things to consider during this time is looking at your timing. How quickly did you respond? Did you respond? Did it take too long for you to respond? Did it take you just the right amount of time? Did you have the right amount of information? And were all the internal teams and content and stakeholders addressed and informed of the information before you maybe went public to the media? Your content, was it accurate? Was the tone of the content that you went out with right? This insight from the social listening will be particularly important here, and potentially even in conversations with some of your close media contacts. They'll be able to provide you with that insight to figure out if that was right during conversations. Did you need to have different types of content ready? Was the fact sheet enough for the website? those types of considerations will allow you just to be a little bit more informed to figure out how the organisation may have to respond in the future. Equally with your spokespeople, how did they perform? Was it the right person? Do you need more spokespeople? Do you need to maybe train them up more? I think it's these types of questions we also need to ask them themselves. How were they comfortable? What areas do they think went well? Where do they think they could have performed better? And work out how you can help to do that and how to achieve that for them. In terms of your actual process, did the plan cover every eventuality? What were the kind of the gaps that may have come out? How could they be rectified for the future? Should you be looking at broadening the scenarios that you're covering? Are there different channels that maybe emerged as part of the process that you want to review and see how you make them work better for you next time? But I think it's also really important to write the culture. You've all potentially just been through a wild ride. It's stressful. Everybody has kind of downed tools from their day jobs, and they've also then had to kind of have that fight or flight mentality. And so after the end of the situation, it's really important to try and write that culture, come together, work to restore this trust internally and externally. And some of that may well be around how open you are in terms of sharing your learnings. We'll come on to an example shortly where that did happen, because it's these steps that will then therefore help to rebuild your reputation after. And it's about then rebuilding that drumbeat of activity. It's about bringing the elements of the work that you were potentially doing pre-crisis back online, or adapting them because it may no longer feel right to progress them, where they're campaigns or news stories or conversations or interviews that you had that you were considering having with external stakeholders or the media. Review those and really consider if it's the right time, and move it around if you need to. Rework that plan to rebuild. So looking at a crisis in practice, I think one that's very close to home and we will probably all be aware of within Scotland is what happened to SEPA at the end of last year. So I think it's worth noting that this isn't Clark, we're not associated in terms of the comms for this. This is purely looking at it from a case study perspective, from an outside in. So what I'll discuss now is showing the time frame, showing what happened, and showing around the times of when they decided to go external with this, and then looking at maybe what went well and how they have moved forward as well. So on Christmas Eve, it was SEPA discovered that criminals were demanding a ransom. They were the victims of a ransomware attack, and they were threatening to unlock the digital systems. And in terms of the communications timeline, so 3 o'clock on Christmas Eve, just as everybody was trying to sign off for the day, unfortunately, it kind of went a little bit haywire. And that was the time when SEPA decided that it was the right time and shared on their social media channels at that point that they were experiencing a technical difficulty, which looked like a systems outage at the time. Just 4 hours later, we can see that they decided to take that step to confirm that they were responding to a significant cyber attack, which were impacting contact centres, internal systems, etc. And I think what worked really well is in that time where they were then taking stock of the situation. I doubt many people had many Christmas dinners, unfortunately, but they then took that kind of 10 days to 2 weeks to really explore and solidify and figure out what facts they had in place. So by the 5th of January, we saw that SEPA had launched a crisis response section on their website, and that's something that continued for several months following the attack. That was really important. It included a really robust Q&A, insight into what happened, and it allowed external stakeholders to know that there was some level of support mechanism in place if they had been impacted. 9 days later, so on the 14th of January, that's when the real media machines started to happen. And that's when it was revealed that cyber criminals were demanding a ransom for the data that had been captured. And this was the story that was then revealed covered by news outlets. And that's when quite a hard-hitting media outreach started from SEPA as well. So there was a media web page that was also included on the SEPA website, the main statements that they had been issuing in terms of the timing, and that allowed media to really have that concentrated one view and go to that one resource to get all of the updated information, as well as being able to look at that crisis response section. And that really allowed them, from our perspective, to control the message, to centralize where people were getting their information from. And it basically followed that one stream of content that went out. They also then worked really proactively as they rebuilt trust, not only during that time post the 14th of January, but onwards as well. So they provided that clarity around the recovery. They shared weekly status updates. They were really transparent and clear in their message and how they conveyed that message, so that people were aware of what the latest updates were. They also then were involved within Cyber Scotland Week, which took place towards the end of February, and obviously was only really when the organisation was almost just coming towards the end of the kind of the incident. And they also, in timing with that, prepared an opinion editorial that was placed within the Times as well. Again, showing their experience, showing that transparency of what had happened, showing how they had been impacted. And they have been obviously continue to be very open, and we've seen in the recent weeks the financial cost that is obviously made on the organisation, and again I think that shows rebuilds that trust in terms of demonstrating the transparency that the organisation has had, and that's been really important. Terry Ahern has obviously been very vocal on social in terms of thanking media who have maybe covered the piece as well as engaging on social and with the media to demonstrate what they have been working on. And the process brought into account and pulled together everybody, including the Scottish Government, Police Scotland, NCSC, and also the SPRC have been involved in that too. And I think, again, showing that unity of the organisations that have been working to counsel, support and address the situation with SEPA. I think that also demonstrates the seriousness that happened, but also the gravity of the situation that SEPA had brought these organisations in to rectify it, and it's to help them move them forward in the future to rebuild that reputation and any trust issues that may have been encountered as a result of that situation. And I think that now they're going to be an organisation that are a case study. They are going to be used for learnings. And obviously internally, they are working hard now to rectify where there were any security gaps and those chinks in the chain that may have been slightly weaker. So again, I would say overall, whilst an undoubtedly awful situation to be in, they handled the situation extremely well from a communications and reputation perspective so that they can move forward from here. So I think we've got some questions that were submitted from the group, and then we'll maybe after these move into opening up the line a wee bit. I know it looks like the chat function has been quite busy over the last hour or so, and I know there's been a few questions in the Q&A. But Leslie, do you want to take the first?
Sure. I actually just want to make a couple of observations on the case study as well for SEPA, that back some of the things that we've been saying. I suspect, but as Kirsten said, we don't work with SEPA, so we weren't involved in this. This was purely a case study. But I suspect as an organisation that SEPA are very well practiced in their comms response to a crisis, just given what it is that they do. Now, it may not have been specifically how do we respond to to a ransomware crisis or a data breach, but by their very nature as an organisation, they will know who their spokespeople are. They'll know who their key media are. They will have systems in place to know who you pick up the phone to when these things happen. And I would 100% put money on it that they clicked straight into those systems, particularly given that the crisis that they hit happened to them at 3 o'clock on Christmas Eve. And from experience, crises never happen at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning when everybody is, just got up and ready for the week. They happen at 10 o'clock on Friday night. They happen at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, or they happen at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Eve. So that is why the more work that you have at your fingertips when these things happen, the better. Just going on to the questions. Thanks, Kirsten. Thank you for submitting questions. We've got 4 good questions here that we're just going to go through. Is there a priority order for whom you communicate with in the event of a cybersecurity information incident? And the short answer to that is yes, but it will be different for every organisation because it depends who you are and who your stakeholders are. So when you're prepping or planning for a crisis, you need to define who those stakeholder groups are and then put them into priority order. It may also, your priority may depend on what has happened, in that, there are certain people that you need to phone first if a certain thing has happened. But that is something that you can sit and you can work through with the, with the luxury of time. Your stakeholders will be the same today as they are in 3 weeks' time at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon or 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So that's a piece of work that you can do now and have the benefit of that later. And where you're doing that, you can also plan who should speak to all those different stakeholders. It may be that you have to communicate with a large amount of people at the same time with different messages. So your shareholders, your kind of wider board, your employees, your customers, your partners, your suppliers. You might need to speak to a lot of those people at the same time. So it's worthwhile looking at your senior management team and trying to break some of that down so we can say, okay, in 3 weeks' time, if a crisis happens, you're going to be out front, CEO, you're going to be speaking to the media, or you're going to be speaking to customers, but that's going to be written for you. It's going to have your name on it. Or CTO, you're going to speak to X, Y, Z. Head of HR is maybe going to be the person that's going to be speaking to the internal team. So, depending on who you've got in your organisation, work out who are the best people, because you're going to have to split your team at some point. And as I say, it could be, it could even go to government, which actually leads to the next question. So I'll leave that with Kirsten, but somebody might need to be keeping government and regulatory bodies up to date as well. As it says here, your communication priority should flow from the most to the least impacted audience. So, there are some that you can update a little bit later, but the way that I always like to think about it is who is going to be put out by the fact that they haven't been communicated with, and if they are rightly so that they would be put out, then they have to come right up to the top of the priority list. Any statements, I've talked about government there, but any statements that you put together at that point should be very plain, very precise, very concise, include facts, try not to include conjecture at that, at that very sort of early stage, and use language to put the crisis into context. This is something that's happening to you, but you have to make other people understand it. Is it a common thing, which could be good? It could be something that happens to you that's happening to lots of other people. Is it extremely rare, in which case, it's an isolated incident, and it's being dealt with in that way. You have to be able to have that language at your fingertips to frame something pretty quickly. Kirsten, on to the next one, which is about government.
Which is about government, yes. So what are the expectations from the Scottish Government on briefing that they were requiring in terms of an incident? And I may slightly defer to somebody from the SBRC on this. So in terms of this specific response, there is no firm guidance. Obviously, as Leslie mentioned, it really does depend on the breach, who's been impacted by the activity as well. However, should there be reporting required, that kind of chain of command, obviously aside from government, if that is something, is that if you are a government agency, for example, or you would naturally report into them, you need to contact the police, then customers, and then the Information Commissioner's office as well. It may well also be worthwhile getting in touch with the SBRC's incident response line and speaking with Mark for any advice or conversation with him about any insight he might have into similar types of incidents that have been happening recently, from looking at from a trends perspective. He can then, if needed, connect you through to Scottish Government as well. Alternatively, if you would naturally have had a relationship in some shape or form with government, you can contact their cyber team directly. So in essence, it kind of there are several steps you may want to take before, but we're not talking about making these over several days. It's simply in terms of priority order of phone calls during that day when you found out about that incident. But yeah, we have the incident response line through the SBRC, which is available and is a really valuable resource that has been used a lot since it's been launched over the last 6 months or so. And we would recommend that you get in touch with the team there, because they will be able to provide even more accurate advice on how to take that forward. Back to you, Leslie.
Okay, on to the next one. We did touch on this earlier on, but sometimes, obviously, if it's a tech incident, your IT functions might go down completely. And, you know, can you imagine the what happens when we do that on a day-to-day basis? We just sort of lose touch with everything. So how do you still communicate with colleagues or with the media or with your other stakeholders should that arise? So it's not going to surprise anybody to say that I'm going back to the planning stage. This is something that you should be working through as a scenario. You know, obviously it depends on the size of your organisation. You know, your organisation may just be 5 people, it may be 500, in which case you're going to have to treat that very differently. You know, if it's more at the 500 end, you're going to be talking about cascades of information, in which case you need to have everybody's telephone numbers, and you know, all of that information is very difficult to pull together when a crisis is happening. So you need to have it all to hand. So all of that should be worked into the planning process. There are options, obviously, if the tech goes down. You know, if my tech goes down at home, I've sometimes got my own personal sort of tech that I can use, and it may be that people might need to jump over onto that to access something like a dedicated app or an intranet. Dark sites are really handy during a crisis, whereby you can, at the planning stage, you can actually set up a website that just sits there and is switched on when a crisis happens, and it's got relevant phone numbers and things. I would say that is more likely to be for a big organisation. But you can jump onto WhatsApp, and you can have WhatsApp groups set up, or sort of messenger groups, whatever way that you prefer to communicate. So there's definitely things that you can do if your central body of comms has to go down. In a really sort of tech dark scenario, you can go old school. And unfortunately, I remember the days when we had to do it this way. But I used to have a drawer in my kitchen that had a paper copy of every one of my clients' crisis plans in it. And that meant if something happened, and it did happen, what I needed to do, because I wasn't in the office, I didn't have access to my computer. And actually, some of that time I didn't even have a mobile. So you know, I was able to nip downstairs, get into the crisis plan, and immediately start working on it using my landline, probably. So thinking about these things is really important, and I'm so glad that somebody asked that question. That you know, what can we do? But going back to a little bit of old school in terms of actually having a piece of paper with everybody's contact numbers on it, and you know, the right information is one way to do it. The other way, particularly for larger organisations, is having some sort of offsite facility that is completely sheltered from the rest of your organisation. Therefore, switching that on wouldn't be you wouldn't have an impact on the IT of your organisation. For some large organisations, they have an entire offsite comm centre to deal with that sort of thing, and they sit there, probably not being used, but can come in extremely handy during a crisis situation. So it all really depends on the size of your organisation, but it is definitely something to think about now. So thank you very much for that question. And then the next one, I guess we're talking about much smaller organisations for the next question, which is what steps should an organisation or a charity take if any of the resulting articles are inaccurate? That is a really interesting question. And in terms of affording legal fees, well, we would hope that in the main things don't get to that sort of situation. Normally, if there is an inaccuracy with the media, it can be sorted out without having to resort to a legal situation. That would be quite unusual. But one of the things that you really have to think about is what is it that actually makes that piece inaccurate? There are a lot of different shades of getting things wrong when it comes to the media. For instance, 10 facts put together in an article can paint a very inaccurate picture of the situation as you see it, but every single one of those 10 facts could be correct. If you look at it, and if you are looking at it from a legal point of view, that is how the lawyers within the media, because the majority of press will run their copy through a lawyer and let them have a look at it. Quite often, when you look at the sort of standout bits of information in that piece, they're all correct. They just possibly miss out part of the story, or aren't put together in a way that is the same way that you see a situation. So you have to be really careful with sort of maybe looking at it quite coldly to see, is it actually inaccurate? Because a lot of the time there's nothing in there that you could actually fight legally. And in that case, what really comes into play is your relationships with the media that should be built up over a sort of longer period of time. If you've done this, you can contact the journalist or the editor at the title to ask them, could you make a quick change? Or we're not quite sure that really represents what the situation is. Can we explain it to you again so that you can so that we can get that right? But one of the really difficult areas with the press is phoning up and demanding corrections, and comms professionals know how to do that, and always gently. Because the thing that a journalist hates the most is somebody phoning up and telling them that they've got something wrong in a story. And only if you can back that up with that fact there is incorrect, are you going to get anywhere. Excuse me a second. Oh, excuse me. The other thing is does it matter? There are, as I say, there are lots of shades of wrong, and it may be that they've said that you've got 3 offices, and one of them's in Aberdeen, and you think, well, we closed our Aberdeen office down a couple of years ago. Does that contribute to the outcome of the actual story? If it doesn't, just leave it there, because what you don't want to do is keep that story going on, or keep them doing a different iteration of it, you know, sort of adding any fuel to the fire. You know, there are some things that sometimes you just have to live with. Again, we talked right at the beginning about putting out a fact sheet. And making sure there is a fact sheet to hand with all the facts and sort of data about your organisation, and that would be how many offices you've got, what it is you do, how many staff you have, where they're based, all of that sort of thing. It's brilliant if you get that out right at the beginning, and then you're less likely to get some of those facts wrong. Obviously, if you're dealing with a complex situation, some of those facts can be quite difficult to get down. And the last point, long-standing media relationships that allow you to explain things to journalists that you know they trust you. If you're saying to a journalist, you know, you've kind of got this bit wrong and it makes it look an awful lot worse than it is. Can we phrase it in a different way? That conversation is so much easier to have if you know who you're speaking to. So that's, I would say, the key step that an organisation or a charity should take is get to know journalists beforehand. Make sure you put out facts. Is there a next one, Kirsten?
No, we've just got any other questions. I know there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A function. So we've got a question that relates to media training for CEOs and the annual media training and updates, and a question about whether there's any guidance or templates available or thoughts on this. So to cover off.
Okay, well, I'm just looking at the open questions. Kim, thank you. I'm glad you found the session interesting. In terms of annual CEO media training, there are a number of organisations that provide that. If you're happy, I'll ask SBRC to let me have your email address, and I can send you a little bit of information about where you would find info about CEO media training. And Vicky's question, niche bodies, so minimal general media interest, mostly trades. What do you need to think about for general media interest in public body data breach stories? Do you mean, let me just have a look at that question, sorry. Okay, well, first thing I'm going to say about your question there in terms of the fact that you're mostly trade press, quite a lot of the time now, the general press get their stories from reading trade press. Now, I suppose it depends how niche your niche trade press is. But quite often when we have a journalist pick up the phone to us, it's because they've read something in the trade media. So those trade media relationships are really important. In terms of general media interest, it's, even they will have a specific interest in you because of where you are or what you do. So I think you need to think about who might pick up on something. It's very difficult without knowing where you're, who you are as an organisation. But if your stakeholders include the general public or customers, then all of a sudden, if there's a crisis, you could be of interest to the general media. So having that in your crisis plan, knowing who the main people are, what the news desk contacts are, and maybe sort of sitting around a table and doing a bit of a tabletop brainstorm as to how you think they would tackle a story like yours, is a good way to start with it, because then you can start working backwards and working out how you're going to deal with it. Neil has a question here. You were working in the security team at TalkTalk when their data breach occurred. The presentation is a bit of a case study in terms of things that went wrong. But one area you were really uncomfortable with CEO providing incorrect security advice. which criticised a number of publications. Do you feel that today's CEOs are generally better prepared to avoid these situations, pitfalls? I think the short answer to that, Neil, is probably yes. I think CEOs have seen a lot of other CEOs being raked across the coals. And I think CEOs, particularly in the last sort of, 5 to 10 years, which is the time period we're talking about here, have grasped comms as an important part of the management function of a business, as opposed to something that is, that's a bit of an add-on to the sales function. So, and particularly in terms of what we've seen in the last year, I think every organisation has seen that communication is extremely important for their business and therefore are taking it an awful lot more seriously than they used to. We used to have issues with CEOs maybe 10 years ago. We could not get a CEO to do media training because CEOs by their very nature are used to knowing everything and being very efficient and knowing how to do everything. And the answer would generally come back, no, CEO, don't need media training. I'll be fine in front of the media. And then they weren't. And it was always a really difficult balance that we had, and in terms of trying to push the CEO into doing media training, where they were resisting. Now it's the other way around. We've got CEOs asking us, can you make sure I'm media trained? And that is because they've seen people on the news being picked apart, like your CEO that you talk about there. It's not nice to see. It's extremely uncomfortable, and nobody wants to be in that situation. So I really do think over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, there's been a really big shift in that. But thanks for the question. Got any others? Oh, Andrew here. A point rather than a question. The importance of customer contact teams who engage with customers shouldn't be overlooked. Absolutely right. They're often the front line. Andrew, you're absolutely right. And when I talked earlier about everybody in your organisation, from the receptionist to the CEO, could end up being the front line, whoever has contact with someone out with your organisation, and there are very people that won't, they won't have any contact with people, should be included within that planning and that sort of crisis plan that you put together. And it's a really interesting exercise to do, maybe just a tabletop exercise. It doesn't need to be a full-blown, all singing, all dancing crisis scenario situation. But even just having a tabletop and saying, what about David, who works on security at the front door? What about Jackie, who sits on reception? What about somebody in the accounts team? Dealing with somebody there, and somebody asks them, what would their answer be? What should their answer be? How should they deal with that? And it really helps you to start to map that matrix that you talk about, and what you need to put together at that point. So really good point, Andrew. Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions that we've got. Just check that there's no more in the chat. There's a couple of people that would like some information on media training.
There was one more about off the record. Is off the record ever off the record? Is a question that came in through the survey.
No. There you go. I've answered that one. No, it's not. It's no, off the records, never off the record. I can't really add much more to that.
It's simple as that. Just on behalf of SBRC, thank you very much to both of you. If anyone else has any questions, please get them in. Otherwise, we are done. I will send out slides to everyone afterwards, and also our reputation management framework Clark will put together very kindly. You can use, just in relation to Kirsten's previous answer and the Scottish Government, use us. We're here to kind of be there for you whenever you have an issue and you don't really know who to contact the Scottish Government. We're that sort of point between private and public sector. So we're here to help So please use us. That's what we're here for. But apart from that, thanks a million, guys. Absolutely fantastic session as ever.
Thank you, John. You're very welcome, and we're delighted to be back. So thank you.
Thanks,
And thanks, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.